Hello everyone, I'm Trevor Anderson with Nerdware, and today we're talking Terraform variable structure. For our example, I'll be using an AWS VPC module I put together in my VPC guide. Links in the description, let's dive in. Up at the top, we have two different ways to set our VPC's IPv4 CIDR block, which is something all VPCs must have. The CIDR must be either provided explicitly via CIDR block, or one can be pulled from an IP address manager pool, for which they can also optionally specify a netmask length. So to allow our users to pass in their desired configs for this, we'll need some input variables. Now, how should we structure the variables that will provide values for these three arguments? Well, we could create entirely separate variables like this. One for each argument. Since users can set the CIDR in one of two ways, none of these variables must always be provided. So with this variable structure, all three must be made optional by setting their default values to null. But now we have a problem. The structure of our variables conveys inaccurate information to our module's users because it is not the case that all three variables are always optional. All VPCs must have an IPv4 CIDR block, and therefore our users must provide for one using either an explicit CIDR block string or an IPAM pool ID. Now, learning to navigate this kind of dynamic between resource args and input variables, and to work out these kinds of logical challenges in a manner that's effective and concise, is really a key part of making a module that's actually useful to people. So let's take a moment to consider our possible courses of action and weigh our options here. We'll start with the simplest possible course of action. Whenever facing variable problems like this, we could just leave this as is. Perhaps try to warn users in variable descriptions or elsewhere in our documentation, and just allow misconfigured inputs to error out. This option obviously requires the least effort, but we also aren't adding any worthwhile utility if our module merely serves as a thin wrapper around the underlying API. Clearly, making a module that offers less utility and produces more errors is not our goal here, to say the least. But I don't want to say this is never the right answer for all inputs. If an argument or combination of arguments are sufficiently complex, it could very well make more sense to just validate user inputs somewhere else. Perhaps an executable called in a tergrunt before hook or something to that effect. One example that comes to mind that clearly fits this bill of sufficient complexity, IAM policies. With all the various combinations of allow versus deny effects, condition keys, condition operators, you don't want to build all of that vendor domain logic into your modules. Instead, you're significantly better off organizing your IAM policies somewhere else and having your modules take in either an IAM policy ID or JSON encoded string input like I have shown here, and simply letting the API handle the validation. Now, our example here with the VPC CIDR inputs is clearly nowhere near as complex as IAM policy syntax. So let's move on to our next possible course of action. Number 2, we could add variable validation blocks, which offer fail-fast behavior and the ability to customize the error messages displayed to our users. However, a variable's validation block can't reference other variables. So this solution will not work with our existing variable structure, since each would need to check if the other has been provided to see if they're required or not. So let's move on to the next possible course of action, number 3. We could leave the variables as is and validate the inputs using VPC lifecycle preconditions. This is a new feature that just came out this year with Terraform version 1.2, and at long last, it finally offers developers the ability to write cross-variable validation checks like this. For our example here, while this would afford us the ability to customize the error message shown to users, we'd still have a variable structure which needlessly conveys inaccurate information. And let's keep in mind, these type definitions will likely be the first thing our users look for when reading our module's documentation to figure out what inputs they need. So for my money, this is not the best solution for this particular situation. Which leads me to, last but not least, number 4. We could refactor our variables into one input. Now, with this structure, we finally have a required variable. And because these properties are now defined within the same variable block, we have greater flexibility to run whatever validations we'd like on user inputs, and we can keep validation logic right alongside the variables themselves. This does require us, however, to make use of the optional type modifier on our properties, which as of right now is still an experimental feature. However, it is by no means a new feature. The optional type modifier has been around over a year and a half now, since Terraform version 0.14, and according to Terraform's release notes, this is slated to be made part of the official package with the soon-to-be-released version 1.3. So implementing this now will ensure you're already familiar with the feature when it's officially released, and perhaps save you from a bit of refactoring. We can even take this approach one step further and actually put all of our VPC resource inputs in one variable block. Establishing this kind of one-to-one relationship between resources and variables creates a nice organizational structure that makes our module easier to reason about and find what you're looking for, which adds up to a module that's easier to implement and use. If a resource has tons of arguments and your variable is becoming too large and unwieldy, just break it into logical chunks that don't require each other for validation purposes. In the absence of this kind of variable structure, where inputs are grouped by resource, what you'll see instead is that variables are grouped using commented visual separators, and/or you'll have lots of variable names with resource type prefixes like VPC underscore, both of which are certainly better than nothing. For this module, though, I'll be using the one-to-one variable structure, but if your company policy doesn't permit the use of non-stable features like the optional type modifier, or if you just prefer a different structure, do not sweat it. For an alternative, I recommend going with option 3, keep the variables as is, and place the validation logic in a lifecycle precondition in the VPC resource. Just be sure to document the either/or logic in the variable descriptions. There we have it. If you liked this video, please be sure to like and subscribe, and check out more nerdware content on how to code your cloud. Thanks.